The cat let out a sharp, piercing chirp. The map on the wall distorted, the numbers spinning into chaos. The intruder frowned, tapping his earpiece. What's the status? The feed is breaking up. Barnaby wasn't looking at the intruder anymore. He was looking at the vent above the door. The cat's tail flicked once, twice, and then he launched himself, not at David but at the man with the gun. The penthouse erupted into a symphony of breaking glass and muffled shouts. David didn't wait to see who was winning. He dove for the desk, his fingers searching for the hidden compartment that held more than just money. As his hand closed around the cold grip of a revolver, he heard the sound of the door being kicked open. But it wasn't the police. It was a woman in a black tactical suit, her eyes identical to the cat's. "Pick up the cat, David," she commanded, her voice like cracking ice. "We're leaving. Now." David looked at the cat, then at the woman, then at the intruder groaning on the floor. He didn't know who to trust, but the cat was already running toward him, a small silver flash in the dark. The woman didn't wait for David to process the chaos. She moved with the fluid, predatory grace of someone who lived in the margins of the law, her boots silent on the blood-flecked hardwood. David scooped Barnaby into his arms, the cat's body vibrating with that strange, artificial heat. They sprinted through the service exit, the cold air of the concrete stairwell hitting David's face like a physical blow. Behind them, the penthouse erupted, not with a bang but with the hollow thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire. They reached the basement garage in a blur of motion, diving into a matte black SUV that sat idling like a beast in the dark. As the woman slammed the vehicle into gear, tires screaming against the epoxy floor, David looked into the back seat. There was no luggage, no gear, only a row of glowing monitors and a medical bay that looked like it belonged on a spacecraft. The woman caught his gaze in the rearview mirror. Her face was a mask of concentration, her jaw tight enough to snap bone. "He's not just a spy, David," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "He's the only record of the bloodline you're supposed to be protecting." The SUV surged onto the rain-slicked streets of New York, weaving through the midnight traffic with terrifying precision. Barnaby hopped out of David's lap and paced the length of the dashboard, his emerald eyes scanning the streetlights. Every time they passed a police cruiser or a security camera, the cat's ears flattened, and the monitors in the back flickered with raw data streams. David's fingers traced the singed fur on the cat's flank, his mind racing through the names of every rival he'd stepped on to reach the top. None of them had this kind of technology. None of them had a cat that could hack a mainframe. They crossed the bridge into Connecticut, the skyline of Manhattan shrinking into a jagged tooth of light behind them. The woman finally slowed down as they hit the backroads, the dense trees of the northeast closing in like a green tunnel. She pulled into a nondescript gravel driveway hidden behind a wall of overgrown ivy. "Get out," she commanded, "and hold him tight. If he runs, we're both dead before the sun hits the trees." Inside the safe house, the air smelled of ozone and old paper. The woman stripped off her tactical vest, revealing a series of faded tattoos that looked like circuit diagrams. She pointed to a heavy steel table in the center of the room. "Put him there." David complied, his hands shaking as he set Barnaby down. The cat immediately sat upright, his tail wrapped neatly around his paws. The woman grabbed a handheld scanner and ran it over the cat's spine. A holographic display bloomed in the center of the dusty room, showing a complex double helix structure. But it wasn't human and it wasn't entirely feline. It was a map. 10 years ago your father didn't die in a plane crash, she said, her eyes fixed on the display. He was the lead engineer for the Seoul syndicate's Ghost Project. They were building a living ledger, a way to store the location of the world's largest untraceable gold reserve inside a biological host. David's breath hitched. He remembered his father's last phone call, a panicked jumble of words about a silver lining, and keeping the secret fed. The realization hit David like a landslide. The cat wasn't a recording device for his secrets, it was the vault for his father's legacy. Barnaby tilted his head, letting out a soft, melodic chirp that triggered a new layer of the hologram. It was a video file, grainy and distorted. A younger version of David's father appeared, his face bruised, his lab coat stained. "David, if you're seeing this, the Silver Blue found you. He's programmed to seek out sterling DNA. Don't trust the agency. Don't trust the family. The key is in the marrow." The video cut to static as the sound of a helicopter blade began to throb in the distance, vibrating the window panes of the safe house. The woman cursed, reaching for a heavy rifle leaning against the wall. "They tracked the localized hum," she hissed. They know we've decrypted the first layer. She looked at David, her eyes wide with a sudden, desperate intensity. If you think David's father deserved to have his life's work protected from the monsters who killed him, drop a like right now to keep this truth alive. The first flashbang shattered the front window, filling the room with a blinding white light and a roar that felt like a physical punch to the skull. David collapsed to his knees, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Through the haze of smoke and sparks, he saw Barnaby leap from the table. The cat didn't run for cover. He sprinted toward the door, his fur standing on end, his body emitting a pulse of blue light that made the electronic sights of the incoming soldiers flicker and die. The woman opened fire, the rhythm of her rifle providing a jagged heartbeat to the chaos. David scrambled toward the cat, his vision swimming. A soldier in charcoal gray armor burst through the side door, his weapon leveled at David's head. Before the man could pull the trigger, Barnaby launched himself at the soldier's face, his claws finding the gaps in the tactical mask. The man screamed, stumbling back, and the woman finished him with a single, precise shot. "We have to go. The basement tunnel leads to the woods," she yelled, grabbing David by the collar of his ruined suit. They dove through a trapdoor just as a second wave of grenades turned the safe house into a chimney of fire. The tunnel was narrow, damp, and smelled of wet earth. David crawled on his hands and knees, the sound of his own ragged breathing echoing off the low ceiling. Barnaby led the way, his glowing eyes the only light in the suffocating darkness. After what felt like miles, they emerged into the cold air of a Massachusetts forest. The rain had turned to a light mist, clinging to the pine needles like spiderwebs. They didn't stop running until they reached a rusted pickup truck hidden under a camouflage net near a disused logging road. The woman threw the keys to David. "You drive. I need to stabilize the cat's core." The jump he took back there drained his power cells. David climbed into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He was covered in soot, blood, and mud, a far cry from the billionaire who had started the day in a Manhattan penthouse. He looked at the cat lying on the woman's lap, its breathing shallow and mechanical. He realized he was no longer a businessman. He was a fugitive, a guardian, and a target. As he turned the ignition, the radio flickered to life, but it wasn't music. It was a broadcast of his own face on every news channel, a headline scrolling across the bottom. "Billionaire David Sterling wanted for terrorist attack on Manhattan penthouse." He wasn't just being hunted by the syndicate, he was being hunted by the world. And the only thing that could clear his name was currently dying in the seat next to him. David slammed the truck into gear, the tires spitting gravel as they roared toward the Washington border. He knew the truth now, and the truth was a death sentence. The pickup truck's heater kicked out a dry metallic warmth that did nothing to stop the shivering deep in David's bones. They were crossing the state line into Washington, the dense fog of the Pacific Northwest swallowing the road ahead. In the passenger seat, the woman, who had finally introduced herself as Delilah, had Barnaby hooked up to a portable battery pack. The cat's chest plate was retracted, revealing a shimmering lattice of fiber optics that pulsed with a rhythmic, dying violet light. "He's hemorrhaging data," Delilah whispered, her fingers flying over a tablet. The EMP at the safe house cracked his encryption shell. "If we don't get him to a hardline terminal in the next 3 hours, the gold reserve coordinates will overwrite his basic feline instincts. He'll go brain-dead, David. He'll just be a shell of wires and fur." David looked at the cat, the creature that had saved his life twice, and felt a lump form in his throat that no amount of money could dissolve. He pushed the accelerator to the floor, the truck's engine screaming in protest. They reached a decommissioned satellite array tucked into the shadows of the Olympic Peninsula. The massive steel dishes pointed toward the sky like frozen giants, rusted and forgotten by the government. Delilah led them to a bunker hidden beneath the central tower, the air inside smelling of stale ozone and ancient dust. She plugged Barnaby into the main console, and the room roared to life. Screens flickered with green code, scrolling so fast it was a blur. Suddenly the scrolling stopped. A single image appeared on the central monitor. David's own face, but younger, sitting in his father's lap. Below it, a message in Korean flashed in red: "The blood is the key." Delilah turned to David, her face pale in the monitor's glow. "It's not just your DNA they need. It's a specific frequency in your heartbeat. Your father didn't just store the data in the cat. He used you as the final biometric lock. To unlock the gold, you have to be holding the cat when the final sequence initiates." The first twist hit before David could even process the weight of being a living key. The bunker's external sensors began to wail, a high-pitched scream that signaled multiple high-speed targets approaching from the air. But they weren't syndicate helicopters. They were United States military gunships. How did they find us? David demanded, his eyes darting to the monitors. Delilah didn't answer. She was staring at the cat, her hand hovering over a small red button on the console. David, she said, her voice trembling for the first time, I didn't tell you everything. I wasn't sent by your father's allies. I was sent to retrieve the asset for the agency. But seeing you with him, seeing how he fought for you. She paused, her finger twitching. If you think Delilah should choose David over her mission, hit that subscribe button right now to see if loyalty still exists in a world of spies. The second twist was a physical blow. The monitors shifted, showing a live feed from inside the Sterling building in New York. David's board of directors was gathered in the conference room, but they weren't mourning his disappearance. They were standing in a circle around a man David thought had died 20 years ago. His uncle, James Sterling. James looked into the camera as if he knew David was watching. You were always the weak link, David, James's voice echoed through the bunker speakers. Your father wanted to hide the wealth, to let the empire crumble. But I knew better. Barnaby isn't just a ledger. He's a remote detonator. Once the data is extracted, the cat's core will go critical. You aren't being saved, David. You're being lured to the blast zone. David looked at Barnaby. The cat turned his head, his emerald eyes flickering with a sudden human-like sadness. He let out a long, mournful yowl that sounded like a goodbye. The realization shattered David. The syndicate, the agency, and his own family were all playing a game where the only losers were him and the cat. The military gunships were overhead now, the downdraft from their rotors shaking the bunker's foundations. Delilah grabbed David's arm, her eyes fierce. We can override the detonation, but it requires a manual bypass from inside the cat's subprocessor. It'll wipe his memory. He won't know you. He won't be smart anymore. He'll just be a cat. Or we let the sequence finish and we use the gold to disappear. David didn't hesitate. He reached for Barnaby, pulling the silver-blue creature against his chest, feeling the mechanical hum and the organic heartbeat beneath the fur. Save him, David commanded. I don't care about the gold. I don't care about the empire. Just save my friend. Delilah's hands moved like a blur, her fingers dancing across the keys as the ceiling began to crack under the weight of the assault. The screen turned a blinding white, and a progress bar appeared. Memory wipe, 45%, 60%, 85%. Just as the bar hit 99%, the heavy blast door of the bunker was blown off its hinges. The shockwave threw David and the cat across the room, slamming them into the cold concrete wall. Smoke filled the chamber. David struggled to sit up, his vision blurred by a veil of blood. Through the haze, he saw a pair of combat boots stop in front of him. He looked up into the cold, mechanical eyes of a tactical drone, its Gatling gun spinning up to speed. Behind it stood his uncle James, stepping through the ruins with a smug, victorious smile. James looked at the cat lying motionless on the floor and then at David. All that effort for a pet, David? How sentimental. Now, give me the core, and I might let you live long enough to watch your company burn. David reached out, his fingers brushing Barnaby's cold fur. The cat's eyes were closed. The green glow was gone. He looked like a piece of taxidermy, silent and empty. David felt a rage he didn't know he possessed. He stood up, his hands balled into fists, his luxury watch flashing a hidden red light. You want the core, James? David hissed. Come and take it. But as James stepped forward, Barnaby's tail gave a single sharp flick. The blood on the glass desk wasn't David Sterling's, but the way his heart hammered against his ribs made him think his chest might crack open. A red laser dot danced across his forehead, settling right between his eyes, while the cold steel of a suppressor pressed against the back of his neck. David didn't breathe. The air in the Manhattan penthouse had turned to liquid lead. Across the room, the silver-gray cat he'd pulled from a rainy gutter 3 weeks ago wasn't cowering or hiding under the sofa. Barnaby stood on the mahogany sideboard, his back arched, his emerald eyes reflecting the red glow of the sniper's aim with a terrifying, mechanical stillness. The cat's throat didn't emit a purr or a hiss. Instead, a low-frequency hum vibrated from his chest, sounding like a cooling fan in a high-end server. The man holding the gun leaned in, his breath smelling of stale peppermint and gunpowder. Sign the deed, David, and she's yours, the intruder whispered, sliding a single sheet of paper across the blood-slicked glass. Sign it, or the cat isn't the only thing that dies tonight. David's fingers twitched toward the pen, his eyes locked on Barnaby. The cat blinked, and for a split second the red dot on David's forehead flickered and died. This wasn't supposed to be how a billionaire's life ended, begging for mercy from a shadow while a house cat watched with the eyes of a soldier. 3 weeks ago, David Sterling owned the skyline of the District of Columbia and half of New York's digital infrastructure. Now he was a ghost in his own home, caught in a web of corporate espionage and ancient blood feuds that stretched back to the Seoul underworld. To understand the gravity of the choice David was about to make, you have to see the moment the rain changed everything. If you believe that even the coldest hearts deserve a chance at loyalty, hit the like button so this story finds the people who need to know that some debts are paid in blood. The rain in Washington had been relentless that Tuesday, a cold, needle-like downpour that turned the marble monuments into gray tombstones. David's charcoal wool coat was soaked through by the time he reached the alleyway behind the Sterling building. He'd stepped out for a cigarette, a habit he kept hidden from his board of directors, when he heard the sound. It wasn't a meow, it was a wet, ragged wheeze. Tucked between two overflowing dumpsters was a bundle of silver fur, matted with oil and crimson. The creature's leg was bent at an impossible angle, and a jagged piece of glass was embedded in its flank. David reached out, his hand hovering over the trembling animal. The cat didn't flinch. It turned its head, and even through the grime, those emerald eyes pinned David to the spot. There was no fear in them. Only a cold, calculating recognition. David scooped the animal into his coat, ignoring the way the blood stained his $5,000 suit. He told himself it was pity. He didn't realize he was bringing a Trojan horse into the center of his empire. Back at the penthouse, the transformation began. David's private vet set the leg and stitched the wound, marveling at how the cat didn't make a sound during the entire procedure. David named him Barnaby, a name that felt sturdy and unassuming. For the first 10 days, Barnaby did what cats do. He slept in the sunbeams and watched the birds over Central Park. But the anomaly started on day 11. David was in his home office, navigating a hostile takeover of a Korean shipping giant, his voice rising as he argued with his legal team over a secure line. He didn't notice Barnaby sitting on the corner of the desk, his ears twitching in a rhythmic, staccato pattern. When David hung up, he found the cat staring at the encrypted laptop. Barnaby's paw swiped the air just above the keyboard, almost as if he were tracing the sequence of the password David had just typed. David chuckled, scratching the cat behind the ears. He didn't see the tiny, microscopic lens embedded in the cat's tear duct capture the reflection of his retinal scan. The first complication arrived in the form of a black envelope slid under the door. Inside was a single photograph, David in the alleyway carrying the wounded cat. Written on the back in precise, elegant calligraphy were 5 words. The debt is nearly due. David's skin went cold. He checked his security feeds. Nothing. He checked the hallway cameras. Empty. He looked at Barnaby, who was currently batting a crumpled piece of paper across the floor. The cat looked innocent, a picture of domestic bliss, but as David watched, Barnaby stopped mid-play. The cat turned his head toward the vents, his body stiffening into a tactical crouch. A faint clicking sound, like a hard drive spinning up, emanated from the cat's ribcage. David approached him, reaching down to pick him up, but Barnaby let out a sound that wasn't a growl, it was a burst of static. David's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from an unknown number. He's listening, David. Are you? The billionaire backed away, his heart thudding against his ribs. He looked at the cat, then at the laptop, then at the vents. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with a sudden electrical current that made the hair on his arms stand up. He realized then that the wounds he'd found on the cat were too clean, too purposeful. The glass in the flank hadn't been an accident. It was an antenna. Barnaby wasn't a rescue. He was a biological recording device, a living piece of hardware designed to bypass every digital firewall David Sterling had ever built. David lunged for the cat, his hands grasping at the silver fur, but Barnaby moved with a speed that defied physics. He leaped to the top of the bookshelf, looking down at David with those glowing green eyes, and for the first time, a voice didn't come from the hallway or the phone. It came from the cat's open mouth, a synthesized, perfect imitation of David's own voice. The deed, David. We need the deed. David stumbled back, his heel catching on the edge of the rug. The lights in the penthouse flickered and died, plunging the room into a suffocating darkness lit only by the emerald glow of the creature on the shelf. The floorboards creaked behind him. He turned, his hands out to guard his face, but there was no one there. Only the sound of the rain against the glass and the low, mechanical hum of the cat. He reached for the lamp, but his fingers met a cold, gloved hand instead. The intruder stepped out of the shadows, a silencer leveled at David's chest. You have 10 minutes before the system wipes your accounts, the man said. David looked at Barnaby, who was now sitting calmly at the intruder's feet. The betrayal felt like a physical weight in his stomach, a cold blade twisting in his gut. He had shared his secrets with this animal. He had let it sleep on his bed while he discussed the movements of millions of dollars. The cat blinked, and a holographic map of David's offshore accounts projected from its eyes onto the wall. David realized he hadn't just saved a life. He had invited his own executioner to dinner. He looked at the pen, then at the man, then at the cat that had once leaned its head against his hand for comfort. He reached for the paper, but his hand stopped. The drone's spinning barrels whirred into a lethal hum, a sound that vibrated in David's teeth, but the expected hail of lead never came. Instead, every light in the bunker turned a violent, strobing crimson. Barnaby's eyes snapped open, not the emerald green David had grown to love, but a searing electric white that illuminated the thick dust like a lightning strike. The cat didn't move toward David, he moved toward the drone. With a screech of tearing metal that sounded like a violin string snapping, Barnaby's body emitted a concentrated electromagnetic pulse. The drone sputtered, sparks showering James Sterling's expensive silk suit as the machine collapsed into a heap of useless junk. James stumbled back, his face a mask of sudden, panicked calculation. The bypass, it was a trap, James whispered, reaching for a sidearm tucked into his waistband. But Delilah was faster. She tackled him into the shadows of the server racks, the two of them becoming a blur of striking limbs and muffled grunts. David scrambled to Barnaby, his hands hovering over the cat's silver fur. The cat was vibrating, a low-frequency drone that made the very air feel heavy and thick. "Barnaby, stop," David pleaded, his voice cracking. He could see the fiber optics beneath the cat's skin beginning to melt, the purple light turning into a jagged, angry red. The cat was overclocking his own systems to protect David, burning through his biological and mechanical components at a rate that would leave nothing but ash. Across the room, a heavy thud signaled the end of the struggle. Delilah stood over James's unconscious body, her lip bleeding, her shoulders sagging. She looked at the cat and then at David, the horror dawning on her face. "The wipe didn't finish, David. The core is in a feedback loop. He's trying to delete the coordinates and the detonator at the same time, but his brain can't handle the load." The bunker's structural integrity was failing, the ceiling groaning as the military above began a second, more focused bombardment. Dust rained down like gray snow. David grabbed a heavy lead-lined briefcase from the floor, a relic of the Cold War bunker, and shoved Barnaby inside, hoping to dampen the signal. But as he closed the lid, he felt a cold, wet nose press against his thumb one last time. The cat's eyes flickered back to green for a fraction of a second, a look of pure, ancient recognition passing between them, before the light died out completely. David's heart felt like it had been hollowed out with a rusted spoon. He didn't have time to mourn. He grabbed Delilah's hand, and they sprinted toward the emergency ventilation shaft, leaving the gold, the legacy, and David's uncle behind in the crumbling tomb. If you believe that Barnaby's sacrifice shouldn't be in vain, leave a like right now to honor the only friend David had left in this world. They emerged into the freezing air of the Washington night, the forest a chaotic theater of searchlights and screaming jet engines. They were deep in the backcountry now, where the trees were thick enough to hide a small army. David clutched the briefcase to his chest as if it were his own heart, his boots sinking into the mud. They reached a narrow ravine, the sound of a rushing river echoing from below. "We have to jump," Delilah shouted over the roar of a passing Black Hawk helicopter. "It's the only way to lose the thermal trackers." David looked into the black abyss of the water. He wasn't a hero, he was a man who had spent his life in boardrooms and penthouses. But as he looked at the briefcase, he felt a surge of cold, hard resolve. He jumped. The water was 1,000 needles of ice, a shock that pulled the air from his lungs and threatened to drag him into the dark. He fought the current, one hand gripping his coat, the other clamped onto the handle of the briefcase. He washed up a mile downstream, his limbs blue and unresponsive, his designer clothes shredded. Delilah was nowhere to be seen. He dragged himself onto a gravel bank, coughing up freezing river water, his eyes searching the treeline for any sign of his pursuers. The silence of the woods was terrifying. He fumbled with the latches of the briefcase, his fingers numb and clumsy. When the lid popped open, Barnaby was there, his silver fur matted and dull, his body as cold as the river. David let out a ragged, broken sob, pulling the cat into his lap, oblivious to the fact that he was currently sitting on the most sought-after data in the Western Hemisphere. "He's not gone yet, David?" The voice came from the shadows behind him. David spun around, reaching for the revolver he'd tucked into his belt, but his hand stopped. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a man who looked exactly like David, only 30 years older. His father. David's breath hitched in his throat, his mind refusing to accept the image. You died. I saw the wreckage. The older man stepped into the moonlight, his face etched with a decade of hiding and regret. I had to let you believe that, David. For your safety. And for the blue. He looked down at the cat in David's lap. The agency is 10 minutes away. We have to finish the transfer. The gold isn't money, David. It's a series of codes that control the global power grid. If the syndicate gets it, the world goes dark. If the agency gets it, the world is enslaved. Barnaby chose you because you were the only one who wouldn't use it. His father knelt beside him, producing a small needle-like device from his pocket. I can restart his core, but it will consume the data. The gold will be gone forever. You'll be a regular man again. No fortune, no company, no empire. Just you and a cat that will never remember who you are. David looked at the man he had mourned for 20 years, then at the creature that had given everything to keep him alive. The stakes weren't just about his life anymore, they were about the future of every person on the planet. David looked back at the tree-line, where the first flickers of tactical flashlights were appearing through the fog. Do it, David whispered. Save him. Destroy the codes. His father nodded, the needle plunging into the cat's neck just as the first shout of, "Target acquired," echoed through the woods. The needle hissed as it injected a luminescent azure fluid into Barnaby's neck, and for a heartbeat, the entire forest seemed to hold its breath. A low, thrumming vibration shook the ground, a sound like a distant turbine spinning up to a frequency beyond human hearing. Suddenly, a pillar of white light erupted from the cat's chest, shooting upward through the canopy and piercing the Washington fog like a spear. Above them, the overhead gunships sputtered. Their electronic displays went black, their rotors losing speed as the EMP wave washed over the valley. David watched as the digital maps of the global power grid projected into the mist, a glowing golden web of light that represented the lifeblood of modern civilization. With a sharp, crystalline sound, the web began to shatter. One by one, the golden threads dissolved into the air, turning into harmless static that drifted down like glowing snow. The gold was being deleted, erased from existence by the very creature that had guarded it. He's doing it, David's father whispered, his face illuminated by the dying glow of the data. He's choosing to be free. But the syndicate wasn't going to let their prize vanish without a final bloody act of spite. From the darkness of the tree-line, a figure emerged, his silhouette jagged and broken. It was James Sterling, his face scorched from the bunker explosion, his eyes burning with a madness that no amount of wealth could cure. He didn't have a drone or a team anymore. He only had a heavy-caliber handgun and the wreckage of his pride. If I can't rule the world in the dark, David, you won't live to see the dawn. James screamed, his voice a raw, animalistic tear in the silence. He leveled the gun at David's father, his finger tightening on the trigger. David didn't think, he didn't calculate the odds or the market value of his own life. He threw himself in front of his father, his eyes squeezed shut, bracing for the impact that would end his story. The gunshot was a deafening crack that echoed off the mountainside, a sound so loud it felt like the sky was falling. But there was no pain. David opened his eyes to see Barnaby midair. The cat, his fur no longer silver but glowing with a residual blinding white light, had launched himself from the briefcase. He didn't hit James, he hit the bullet. A spark of blue energy flared at the point of impact, a localized distortion in space that sent the projectile spinning harmlessly into a cedar tree. The effort cost Barnaby the last of his artificial life force. The cat fell to the mud, his body turning from glowing white to a dull ash gray. James stared at his empty hand, the gun jammed by the sheer force of the energy surge. Before he could clear it, Delilah appeared from the riverbank like a vengeful shadow. She didn't use a gun. She used a high-tension cable, sweeping James's legs out from under him and pinning him to the earth with a series of brutal, efficient strikes. "It's over, James," she hissed, her knee pressed into his throat. "The agency is coming and they don't have a penthouse waiting for you. They have a hole in the ground." David ignored them all. He crawled to where Barnaby lay in the dirt, the cat's chest silent, his eyes fixed on the stars. The military units were closing in now, their footfalls heavy on the wet leaves, but the air of authority was gone. They were just men lost in the woods without their digital maps and thermal sights. David's father placed a hand on David's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that felt decades overdue. "You did the right thing, son. The world will wake up tomorrow and they won't even know how close they came to the end. But he gave everything. David picked up the small limp body, the silver fur feeling like cold silk. He looked at the horizon, where the first hint of gray was beginning to bleed into the black. He had lost his money, his status, and his security, but for the first time in his life he felt a weight lifted from his soul. The billionaire was dead. The man was finally awake. As the first sunlight hit the clearing, reflecting off the river, a miracle occurred. A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch moved the cat's tail. Then a soft, ragged breath escaped his lungs. Barnaby's eyes opened, but the emerald fire was gone. They were a simple pale green, the eyes of a normal stray cat. He looked at David, his head tilting in confusion, his ears twitching at the sound of a distant bird. He didn't see a key or a target. He saw a man who smelled of rain and tobacco. Barnaby let out a soft, weak meow and began to purr, not a mechanical hum but a warm, vibrating thrum that signaled he was finally home. David clutched him to his chest, tears finally breaking through his resolve, as the helicopters circled above. If this moment of sacrifice and rebirth moved you, make sure to subscribe for the final chapter of this journey, where we see what happens when the man who had everything starts over with nothing but a friend.